Hello, I'm Charles Reed Anderson, founder of CRA and Associates and host of the TechBurst Asia podcast. And today we're going to talk about smart cities, and more specifically, how my view on the future of smart cities is changing. To start off though, I should let you know, I've been in the industry for quite a long time, and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the industry. I love the fact that we have technologies and solutions that can fundamentally transform the way we work, live, and play. But I hate the fact that as an industry, we tend to overhype, oversimplify, and underdeliver on a lot of the initiatives. We could be having so much more impact on our infrastructure and on our citizens. Don't get me wrong though, I understand it. Cities are complicated. Every city is going to have 25 to 30 different government agencies. Each of those agencies could have hundreds or thousands of use cases, which means you have a lot of stakeholders to satisfy. It's difficult and it's complex, but sometimes I think we just make too many excuses and we deliver too little action. And I go out and I talk to people in cities and the vendor community, and I hear a lot of the same things. Cities, they're really slow to act. They have their internal processes that slows down the process. They always have limited budgets. They're very risk averse. They don't have the skill sets they need to deliver these things, and they don't have a culture of innovation. But these things aren't insurmountable, so why don't we actually deliver more? But recently, in the past couple of years, my view is starting to change a little bit. And what I want to do is walk you through why I'm suddenly getting a little bit more optimistic about the future of smart cities. Really, it comes down to one thing. There's no time for excuses during a pandemic. And we've seen these same cities that were making a lot of excuses before, just getting on with it and delivering solutions to bring back safe and secure buildings and spaces. So what I want to do is talk about some of these different initiatives and what we have actually seen in the cities, and that has helped them overcome these challenges they were facing in the past. Before, we thought cities can't move fast. Well, in a pandemic, they move very fast. Just think about how quick they were to start implementing safe and secure spaces. They started leveraging technologies like autonomous cleaning robots and touchless entry and spatial analytics to make sure we're social distancing. All these solutions were already available, but they weren't being implemented. Introduce a pandemic, suddenly these things are all over the place quickly. And then the thing that really got us through the pandemic, most countries lost some very robust contact tracing solutions. And these are great because it helped minimize the spread of the transmission of the virus. And some of the fun things we've been doing is implementing facial recognition. Countries like China and Russia were using facial recognition to track when people would be breaking lockdown rules or breaking their stay-at-home notice. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that's China and Russia, they can do that. Well, right now in Australia, 6 states are testing facial recognition to make sure people follow their stay-at-home notices. And this is going to be fun to watch because the Aussies, in general, are the least trusting of government of any developed market. So watch the press and see how this one goes. But I like it because we're having to face the real decisions about this right now. What is the acceptable and ethical use of data? Another thing cities have proved is that they can overcome bureaucracy. The city of Philadelphia, for a couple years, was trying to get Chromebooks for children who were underprivileged, and they couldn't really get it done. You suddenly lock down a city and make all kids study and go to school from home. Within 2 weeks, they were able to procure 50,000 Chromebooks. So we can act fast. We can eliminate red tape if we want to. We just normally don't. So we need to keep these things going forward and not forget that we can do this once the pandemic is over. Another thing we've been seeing is you don't really need huge budgets to deliver a lot of these solutions. And that's because you can leverage existing assets. And this use case is actually a bit old. It's about 5 years old, but it's one of my favorites. And it's from Alibaba, and it was launched in Hangzhou. And the idea was they wanted to be able to reduce the amount of congestion, traffic congestion in the city. So at the time, Hangzhou was the 5th most congested city in China, and now it's the 57th most. And what really happened? Well, the city brain takes existing data that comes from sensors and cameras around the city, like CCTV, intersection cameras, and GPS data from public transport. It turns that into intelligence that can then control the stoplights to start easing traffic congestion. And I love this because they rolled it out in cities across China, but now it's getting put into places like Kuala Lumpur, which is also a very congested city. And this model is about leveraging existing assets. You don't always have to go out and buy the latest kit. You can leverage what you have. And the next place this is going to take off is inside of our buildings. We don't need more data inside of our buildings right now. We need more intelligence, and we're waking up to the fact of that. but it's been a long ride. But let me explain how it is for someone who's maybe a facilities manager within a city. Inside of one of his buildings, he's going to have a bunch of traditional building management platforms. Could be HVAC or lighting or lift management. There's probably 10, 12, or 20 different platforms for every building, all on different vendors, which makes it a real headache. But now think about it. What if I don't have one building? What if I have public housing and I have hundreds of buildings? I could have thousands of different platforms. I don't have an easy access to this data. And then you got to think about post-COVID, what's going to happen. You're going to be adding in a lot more platforms, and suddenly it's a logistical nightmare. So what the move right now, where everyone's going towards, is creating these platforms. It's basically one platform that aggregates data from everywhere else, and it provides the users with a single version of the truth. You can start looking at across your whole estate. What I like about this model is it doesn't really involve buying a lot of new kit. It's basically software as a service. And it's really easy then to start reducing your energy costs, extending the life of your assets, and most importantly, start benchmarking your buildings. Why is one more energy efficient than the other? What can you learn? But this is a bit of a strange one because this platform of platforms, it's been out there for 5 years now and it hasn't taken off. And the reason is because the traditional vendors who are in this space, they like the siloed approach. So it's really been done by a lot of startups and they have trouble scaling. But in the last 2 years, there's been a lot of new market drivers that means this is going to be the hot space right now. The first is the rise of sustainability. We've seen countries across the world starting to increase their targets, putting in more restrictions on carbon emissions and reporting requirements on carbon emissions as well. That means people are being forced to act. And what people are realizing, if I'm a facilities manager or I own a building, I've got tenants who actually are going to need this. Most interesting though is the new market entrants that are starting to drive this. And it's because people are starting to realize that these buildings, it's not a real estate problem, it's a data problem. And if I understand data, I can move into that space. So one approach was from someone like Bosch, who does a little bit of the building space, but normally doesn't make the BMS platforms. But what they did at the beginning of COVID was open up their IoT suite to start aggregating all this data and to help clients better manage their buildings. And that was a great approach. And then you've got the holistic approach. And Hitachi's new strategy for a lot of their greenfield developments is we'll aggregate all the data into a single management platform. We'll also then aggregate your procurement of all the infrastructure that supports it, and we'll start bringing in the consumer data ecosystems as well. But one of the most fun ones is the opportunistic approach. Microsoft and Telstra are partnering to deliver digital twins of buildings in Australia. And you might think, what does a tech vendor and a mobile operator have to do in this space? Well, Microsoft, they're pretty good when it comes to doing data and analytics. And Telstra, they own the enterprise market. So you're bringing together people who can solve the data problem and have access to the demand. So it's actually a great approach. And it isn't just these. These are the tip of the iceberg. All the urban solution vendors, all the commercial real estate firms, they're starting to look at how we can deliver these platforms and what you can do with them going forward. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. Next thing we've learned during the pandemic is that cities can overcome risk. And if you've ever heard of Darwin in Australia, what you probably have heard about it is it's famous for their saltwater crocs. No, we haven't found a way to mitigate the risk of getting attacked by a crocodile while you're surfing, but they did overcome another risk. A couple of years ago, Darwin, even though it's only 130,000 people, delivered the largest smart city initiative in Australia. And part of that was facial and vehicle recognition. But they didn't turn it on right away because they were concerned about how the citizens would view this. It would cause a risk. And citizens are concerned about their data privacy. So what Darwin did is they partnered with Singapore's telecom regulator, IMDA, because IMDA had just launched an AI data governance framework. It helps clients, it could be a city or a building owner or somebody else, about how do you ensure what is the acceptable and ethical use of the data that you're capturing. And Darwin implemented these processes and is now viewed as best practice. So they've helped mitigate that risk they faced of the citizen and press backlash. Another thing people have been doing a lot during the pandemic is realizing finally, we can't do this alone, and people are starting to partner a lot more. And there's some interesting ones out there. The Global Organization of Smart Cities brings together 200 tech vendors and cities to partner on intercity proof of concepts, to share best practice, and to try and learn from each other. The Urban Technology Alliance is based in Europe and Asia and does something very similar, but they also have a lot of test beds around the world to try and solve specific problems. And one of the most interesting ones lately, Stanford University is partnering with Entrants in Korea to basically create a smart city research center. And they want to look at the data that that city is capturing and figure out what you can do with it. They're going to advise them on how they can better fund and finance their infrastructure going forward, look at sustainability, and create a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. So people are learning that we can work together and it makes it much better for everybody. Finally, that's happening. And the final one on this is cities can change their culture, so don't tell me they can't. And this is my favorite example, and it's Taipei City. Taipei had a new mayor a few years back, and he was concerned when he came in that they weren't innovative enough when it came to their smart cities approach. And he thought what was driving it was a fear of failure. They're very risk averse and they didn't want to experiment with a proof of concept because it might fail. So he said, we're going to change the culture. And to do that, he did a few interesting things. So what they decided to do was pull the program management office outside of the government and make the government a client of it. So the PMO then went out and engaged 30 different government agencies to understand their demand requirements. But they didn't stop there. They went out and captured the needs of 32,000 citizens to find out what they're looking for in a smart city. So they understood where the demand was. But this is the really interesting part. They proactively engaged 500 plus ICT vendors to say, let's work together and start delivering proof of concepts. And in just over a 2-year period, they delivered 200 of those. And this is unheard of in cities. Most cities during that time would deliver 5, 10, or 20. They did 200. But it wasn't just the culture they changed. They actually ticked off everything we've been talking about. They proved that they can act fast. Most cities, when they do proof of concepts, it can go on for a year, or 2 years, or 3 years for a proof of concept. They were doing it in a matter of months. They also had a very transparent process. This is how we're going to define success metrics and deliver these going forward. On the budget side, they were honest with these vendors. They told them, we don't have a lot of money to support this, but we have assets and we have resources that we'll put at your disposal to help deliver these, and we'll help you publicize it afterwards. And they started to accept risk. They didn't think 200 were going to work. A small percentage were going to work, but that would be use cases that could really transform cities in the future. And on the skill side, by bringing together all these different vendors and groups within the city and the citizens, they get access to all those ideas going forward. So it's a brilliant example of how you can actually really deliver change within a city. So there are reasons to start being a little bit more optimistic. But me, I'm still relatively cautious. But I would say I've transformed from being maybe a pragmatist to a conditional optimist. And I'll explain it this way. Look at this in Margaret right now. We've got technology enablers that can solve a lot of our sustainability problem statements around carbon emissions, clean water, and clean energy. It should be simple, right? The challenge is when you start bringing supply and demand together, it gets very complex. These two sides don't really play nicely because they view it as a zero-sum game. Vendors want to make as much as they can, cities want it for as little as possible. So even though we have the technology to solve a lot of these problems that are causing our sustainability issues, we're not delivering it. And that's why it's not just about supply and demand. What's really changed the market is the regulatory environment and investment. Governments are setting up those regulations, like I mentioned earlier, and that's forcing cities to act. But also the investment side of the ecosystem is getting active, and the financial markets are saying, listen, Mr. MNC, if you want to go out and have us reporting on you, we need to know how you're dealing with your carbon emissions and what you're doing to go towards net carbon zero. So there is reasons to be optimistic, but realize this is complex because that just explains sustainability, and there's hundreds of use cases we need this all to come together. So we need more collaboration, not just from tech and from demand side of it. We need to get regulatory investment, everybody involved to start driving this going forward. So in closing, just a few little tidbits here that you should remember. Number one, beware the hype. Someone's always going to be selling you the latest, greatest thing that's coming out and will solve all of our problems, or the latest ranking that will distract us from just delivering things. Beware of that. Remember, focus on sourcing and delivering innovation. Number two, remember that change is possible. We love coming up with excuses. Hopefully we'll have learned a lot during the pandemic that we can deliver change and we don't have to behave the way we always have. Number three, focus on the people and not the technology. When I talk to people, it doesn't matter in Europe or in Asia or in the US about the smart cities ecosystem, no one says the technology is holding us back. It's us as humans. We need to change the way that we leverage technology to deliver value back into the ecosystem. And finally on this, it's all about collaboration. No one should be doing this alone. There's going to be great use cases in cities you'll know nothing about, so find ways to get involved in these ecosystems so you can learn from them and deliver more proof of concepts, which will then deliver more value to the cities in the future. Thank you very much for your time.
My name is Jack FitzGerald. I'm the Smart Cities Director with Hitachi APAC, and today I'm talking to Charles Anderson about smart cities. How are you, Charles?
I'm doing very well.
Nice to see you. So, Charles, you are a smart cities expert, but I think it's fair to say you're a Smart Cities Index doubter. Can you explain a bit about that and maybe tell us what you would do differently?
Sure. In my presentation, I talked a little bit about the hype, and things like smart cities ranking sometimes I think can actually be a bit of hype. And the challenge we face is it's not like we're going to go run a race. And if we race for 100 meters, if you get there first, we know you're the winner because we have a metric. We don't have a metric for what a smart city is. We don't have an official definition. So they're very subjective, and that worries me because some of the cities you look at, they might be ranked number 3 or number 4 in one index, but then number 80 in another one. So you just use the one that always looks the best. And I just think it actually distracts a lot of the cities because they spend so much time trying to make sure they get a really good ranking versus actually just putting in the processes and procedures in place to deliver and source innovation. What I would do differently, I would focus on that innovation side. In the presentation, I gave the example of Taipei, and I made it look really, really good, but they haven't gotten to the implementation part. They did great at sourcing the proof of concepts initially. I want to see not only that sourcing part and how you redo the processes and procedures and eliminate bureaucracy in the city, but then have that follow through where you really start delivering a lot more. And I would focus a lot more on that.
Okay, and in terms of smart cities, I think the divide, and we've talked about this before, between the private landlord, where all the technology is being invested, and then the city level, where it's public spaces, it's public infrastructure. That divide is a bit blurry for me, and I wonder sometimes, is the private landlord actually what's making smart cities more than the city itself?
It depends on which city you look at, but I think a smart city doesn't come about in the last few years. It's years and years of investment. I mean, we live in Singapore, and I think it's definitely one of the smartest cities in the world. It didn't happen overnight. There's been a very good long-term strategy for years about making sure you have the proper infrastructure in place to effectively monitor your assets so you can reduce your costs and increase those asset lives. So it's not just done overnight. It's really about a whole ecosystem coming together. And part of that is going to be the city itself. Part of it's going to be private companies or landlords as well.
And that Taiwan example, you said in your presentation it's kind of one of the best examples of how they've set it up. But you've also just said it failed. Well, where does it break down? Why is it breaking down? How can people fix it?
I wouldn't say that it's failed. Maybe it hasn't delivered as many solutions to full deployment as that I would have liked to see. And that could be for a variety of reasons, whether it's budgetary or whatever else. I really wish that more cities would be able to focus on how to deliver that next wave of solutions. But the challenge is most cities right now focus a lot more on infrastructure-centric solutions. We need to get it evolved more into citizen-centric solutions and really change our approach to it. Because right now we're doing a lot of technology for tech's sake, and I want to see more about the human and citizen experience brought into it.
So then, if you think about the big flagship smart city projects, Songdo, Korea, Sidewalk Labs, which never got off the ground, and now NEOM in Saudi, right? What did they do wrong, and what can NEOM do right? Okay,
this is an interesting one because Songdo was a very long process. I think it was about a $30 billion greenfield development. And if you ever go up there, it's an absolutely beautiful city. They've got big, wide boulevards, the buildings are beautiful, but they've never been able to attract the commercial tenants to come out there and actually move there. So they're trying to revitalize it right now. I mentioned that Stanford's working out there. The World Bank is actually working with Seoul National University in the same space to try and improve it. The challenge is they had a long-term plan and they built what somebody defined as the best city for the 20th century. We're now in the 21st century, and it isn't meant for things like urban mobility. So they really have to rethink it. And it's one of those ideas that if you start with a master plan and deliver it over 20 or 30 years, you're working against what you started with. And you need a much more agile approach to start testing, evolving the strategy continually to adapt to the new market demands or technology innovations that are coming out. So that's what I hope they do with NEOM. I think it's going to be an amazing one to watch because of the scale of investment. Some of the top thinkers in the smart cities and mobility space are on there as advisors right now. And obviously they have the funds to experiment. So what they're trying to design is these cities of the future, which is all going to be along a line, and there's going to be micro hubs along that line. And each of those will have commercial, residential, retail. It'll be a city within itself. And then there'll be no cars going through. You can always just use public transport or autonomous vehicles to go back and forth. So it's going to be exciting. I would say definitely take an agile approach to it so you can constantly evolve your deliverables going forward.
But wouldn't you say that like a city like Barcelona or Las Vegas or Singapore, being real cities and being government-led and starting with POCs and layering their smart city approach, when we stand here today in 2021, they have been more successful than your flagship single developer, let's control the whole process and outcome, Because that hasn't worked yet, I would argue.
And I would argue a lot of those bigger cities, a lot of it is about how they're marketing it. Like I said, Singapore is a fantastically smart city. It's not because of just what's happened with Smart Nation. This has been going on for many years, and they've been investing in infrastructure and technology for a long period of time. So it's that type of a city is where you see much more longer term benefits. Barcelona gets hyped up as one of the best cities, but in some of those rankings, it gets really low rankings. So is it the smartest one or not so smart? So I think, each of them, they just need to find better ways to interact better between supply and demand side. So cities, sometimes they're not always that easy to work with when you're a technology vendor or when you're a startup. So I'd like to see the cities make it a much more clear, transparent process of how we're going to engage to deliver proof of concepts. I'd also like to see them cut back on these longer term, 2 to 3 year proof of concepts with no clear success metrics. We end up wasting a lot of time and money on that. We need to innovate fast, fail often if it comes down to that. But let's find what solutions are actually going to deliver tangible value to the citizens and to their infrastructure.
And then you mentioned sustainability, and I would argue, you could say that zero carbon and the race to zero carbon is actually going to propel smart cities more than anything else. Like, where do you see that passage that we're on? Where are we going with that? Because that's what's leading to EVs. That's what's going to lead to mobility, smart energy optimization, smart grid, et cetera, et cetera.
I think we're still in the very early phases of this. A lot of people are talking about it, and that's an important step. All governments are talking about it. I think I didn't really realize the importance of the regulatory side until I created that slide for this presentation. But really, you need these different external market factors to start driving it. When the regulators say, like for instance in Singapore, we don't have the strictest regulations here around sustainability, that's about to change. When that happens, everybody has to act. That means you create markets for the supply side, so the tech vendors and the startups. You could generate demand and it drives it forward. The fact that the financial markets are coming in now and saying, actually, we want to know about your carbon emissions, Mr. MNC or Mrs. MNC, and we need to have you reporting on that regularly because that's how we're going to be evaluating your future. And I think that gets exciting. You're getting more and more pressures on it. And what I also like is on the building side, for instance, when people go out and build new high-rises, you build to spec, so you know what the requirements are today. If they're not that strict of requirements, you don't invest in the great new solutions for the future because there's no premium associated with it. Once you make that required, it starts creating a whole new environment. And I do find it amusing because when I started out my career, I was totally anti-anything government regulation. And now I realize is we need it for sustainability and for things like AI and facial recognition. We need the regulators to come in and say this is acceptable use or ethical use or what you need to do to create green spaces and save the planet.
Yeah, see, my opinion is governments are way behind in this space. And when you look at, I wanted to ask you, because when you look at Facebook and the pressure it's under, you look at big tech, the pressure it's under, and then you start saying, you can argue with COVID, everyone has given up a little bit of their privacy, in Singapore at least, with track and trace, with facial recognition, et cetera. But, there's still a big risk that smart cities will ultimately always trip up because if it's too much, it's too tech heavy, people are going to turn around and go, hey, this isn't what I want.
Well, you saw that with Sidewalk Labs. You mentioned that earlier. Yeah. So if anyone isn't aware of what Sidewalk Labs was doing, it was going to redevelop a waterside development in Toronto. But the idea was Sidewalk Labs, which is part of Alphabet, wasn't going to do it for free. They had a plan to monetize it, and that monetization came off the data that was going to be captured. And it took a while, but then people went, wait a minute, you're going to make money just off my data? I own that data. So they've learned from that. Cities are behind when it comes to this because it's very difficult, because the cities don't know how the citizens are going to react to it. And a great example is, look what happened in Australia a few years back with Telstra. You had the CEO, David Thodey, had to get up on stage and say, I'm sorry because we sold our customers' data to a third party. It didn't break any rules, it made them money, but the citizens didn't like it. So the governments don't know how to regulate this stuff yet, and they are behind on it. And what I think we need to see more of, it isn't just down to the regulatory environment itself, with the government doing it. The government needs to get involved with tech vendors. They need to bring in citizen rights groups and data privacy rights advocates to come in there as well. And it needs to be a group decision, and it's got to be transparent. We got to know what's happening to our data. Do I trust Facebook with my data? No.
But then, what do you say to the argument or the growing noise around dumb cities? So, there are people that say we don't need more tech. We know Facebook, Instagram, and your mobile phone, it's bad for mental health. We're all stuck inside in a pandemic. Actually, we need parks, we need placemaking, we need good design. I think it makes a case, but we would lose our jobs if it makes the case too well. So what do you think about that?
I think it's what needs to happen. I think it's a step in the right direction because we push too much technology just for the sake of pushing it. We've got a new widget, so therefore we must deploy it. And we don't put the citizens or humans in general at the center of the experience. And until you start focusing on that, we're just going to deliver a lot of technology that might have a lot of damaging effects, like some of the stuff we're seeing with Facebook. And what I wish cities would start doing, and think about the way they're set up, most of the time they're starting with their infrastructure. They're finding ways to better monitor it or extend its life or reduce their energy costs. That's very infrastructure centric. I want it to evolve where they're starting to develop and think about the citizens a lot more. And what is that day in the life of Jack as he goes through Singapore? Is he going to interact in these different ways? How is he going to have green space? And that's why what I like seeing is a lot of these mixed use facilities, which is, very well because you worked on Pi Labor Quarter. That really gets inspiring to me because you're starting to see people say, it's not about the whole city anymore. Let's go down to a smart district or a precinct or even a mixed use facility and start creating these environments that bring together commercial, residential, retail, all into one, and green space.
Don't you think that's what missing on that point is, are we ever stopping and thinking as humans, what is the world we want to live in? Because, it's a bit like the sci-fi movies you and I grew up watching is the world we're moving towards. But there's been no discussion, as far as I'm aware, about whether or not we want that as a human race. And you look at Black Mirror, you look at this stuff that's coming, and tech is leading that charge, but as humans, are we stopping and actually having a conversation about it?
In China, they are. And I think probably the most interesting thing is going on in the markets anywhere right now, what's going on in China, because they're cracking down on consumer tech. They're worried about kids gaming too much and that taking over their lives. They're limiting it to, 3 hours over the weekend? You're allowed to game during certain hours now. They've been cracking down on a lot of those, and the Chinese government is very transparent about this. They go out there, they make their statement that we're concerned about this. Part of it was the 996 work style. Tech vendors saying it's a privilege to work 996. Not really. So basically they're saying, well, you're going to stop doing that now, and they've regulated it. And they're really concerned about creating this demographic time bomb that you have in places like the US or in Japan or even in Singapore to an extent, where we work really hard, we use all the tech, but we're just burning ourselves out, and you're not actually creating those next generation of innovators sometimes. So I think they're very concerned about it. I think I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. I think it's an interesting model because it's a very different approach to what we've seen out of the US and in Japan over the years.
Yeah, no, I think that what would be great is if China could actually engage, outside China on this topic. Yeah. Because you're right, they are leading that thought process. In Australia and America and Singapore, you can play games 24 hours a day. Is that a good thing? Yeah. I would say no. But are we talking about it in our societies? Not much. And I think you make a great point. If only China could kind of start to engage with us all and say, we've got, 1.456 billion people. Yeah. We've got a lot of data. We can see what's bad for people, and we're making big decisions that are hard. Maybe we should talk to US, UK about them. It's a fascinating topic, really.
But getting the US and the UK to sit down with China on any topic is a little bit challenging right now. So I think what we can do from the outside, no matter what country you're in, is we should be watching this to see how it evolves. What impact does it have? Obviously for the esports in China, maybe it's not going to be as big anymore, but are they going to start going into more the quality tech side? We know that manufacturing is huge in China, and they don't want to lose manufacturing. If you look at what happened in Japan and the US, it's all been offshore to other places. China wants to be able to start developing quality manufacturing, not just cheap white goods. They want to go into that quality process right now.
And I think what's fascinating about China is we know that there are dozens, if not more than 100 smart cities there. But it's the black box of the smart city industry when you're not in China, right? I have no idea how successful they are. We have no idea whether they are genuinely improving quality of life, delivering government services, or just actually impacting on your privacy.
That's a good question, and to be perfectly honest with you, it's too hard to cover. I think the number is actually 500 plus smart cities, which is a little bit too tough to track when you're not on the ground in those countries. So, yes, there are some great things we're seeing. The stuff that Alibaba has done with its city brand, I still think is one of the best use cases I've ever seen in a city. Plus, I like the model of leveraging your existing assets. But then again, I'm sure there's a lot of things that have been developed and deployed that aren't, delivering as much value as you want. What's unique about China is it can't be done anywhere else in the world. You can't replicate it because you've got the government that sets out its 5-year plan. That means technology vendors know which technologies are going to be used. The demand side of the market knows what's coming out. So everyone's going in the same direction. If I'm on the investment side, I'm funding these things as well. Everybody's going in that same direction. And that's why when you look at things like IoT or 5G, there's two markets. There's China and the rest of the world. No one's going to be able to keep up with them on these things. So that's why I say we should be learning a lot from them right now, because they're going to be going into uncharted territory. So we could take that back and apply it to our own countries.
So that leads me to my last question, and it's the easy one. What's the most exciting thing you're seeing coming through? And I know you're a 5G guy, but whether it's blockchain, AI, talk us about the things that keep you excited.
This is a tough question because there's so many different things. Like on 5G, I like talking about 5G. I think we're nowhere near ready to start really leveraging it yet. I think private 5G is more interesting. But what I'm liking to see right now is a lot of the stuff around analytics and how that's advancing. I like that we're forcing the discussions around things like facial recognition and what is acceptable and ethical use. Because for these types of technologies to really take off, we need to have the ethical discussions up front and start setting some rules. Until that happens, the industry will take off, but not as much, and we might have to go back and rip and replace once we start setting the regulations. So I'm looking forward to really watching that, and I like the fact that a lot of the solutions that have been deployed to support countries and cities during a pandemic have forced this discussion, and I'm glad we're finally having it.
Thank you very much. Great chat.
Always a pleasure.